Hi, I'm Deb Price. I'm the Southeast Asia editor of the Wall Street Journal. I'm the lead writer on No Good Choices, a story about a Hong Kong maid who came from Indonesia and experienced a horrific crime. With me today to talk about maid abuse in Hong Kong and around the world are I-Jean Poo in Chicago, who's an advocate for domestic workers' rights and a winner of this year's MacArthur Genius Award, and Hans Landegard joins me from Hong Kong. He's a professor at Hong Kong Baptist University. He's interviewed hundreds of maids living in shelters. So let's jump right in with our first question, which comes from Adrian Alonso. Adrian asks, why is there such a huge demand for domestic helpers in Hong Kong? Hans, do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, the Hong Kong government doesn't provide affordable childcare, nurseries, kindergartens. Likewise, they don't provide very much care for the elderly. So I think this has been an affordable solution for many middle class and lower middle class families over the years to get cheap labor imported from other Asian countries to look after their children and the elderly.
Comes from Patrick. Our second question comes from Patrick McCarthy on Twitter, who asks, why is there a dependence on Indonesian maids? Why not hire from the mainland China? Hans, do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, it would seem to make good sense, wouldn't it? Because they speak Putonghua, and so they wouldn't have a communication problem they wouldn't have with Indonesian domestic workers. I think it's supply and demand. I think it's about money first and foremost. I think because of the situation in Indonesia and the Philippines, you can get cheap labor, really cheap labor that you couldn't get as cheaply from mainland China. The price would be much higher, I imagine. So that's one thing, and also because it's readily available. So there seems to be an unending number of queuing up in Indonesia and Philippines willing to come to Hong Kong. So I think that's certainly part of the big answer.
What's the process these maids go through? Christopher Pletz on Facebook asks, and I'll answer that one really quickly. Maids come here, for example, from Indonesia. They have been through training facility that where they may have been in training for up to a year, waiting for an employer to pick them. Then they come over to Hong Kong, and then many of them are indebted for several months. They give the majority of their salary to pay for having gotten the job. And for many of them, they report that the live-in requirement, all Hong Kong foreign maids are required to live with their employers. Many of them feel that this puts them in situations where they can be abused. And a survey last year found widespread abuse of maids, which ranged from being verbally abused to physically abused, even sexually abused. So let me go to the next question. Some people on Twitter have pointed out that maid abuse isn't just a problem in Hong Kong. Jen, could you talk about issues that domestic workers are facing in the United States and elsewhere?
Absolutely. Domestic worker abuse is actually quite common in the United States and all over the world. In the United States, for example, there are millions of women, mostly migrants and women of color, who do domestic work, and they're excluded from some of the most basic labor protections that other workers take for granted. And the work is commonly not seen as real work like other forms of work. When the workplace is a private home, there's high degrees of vulnerability because the work is hidden and it's unregistered. So you have a situation where it's essentially a free-for-all. If you happen to find a good employer, then you are likely to receive living wages, and then the whole other end of the spectrum is also possible, where we commonly see human trafficking situations, high degrees of extreme abuse, and everything in between. So there's high degrees of vulnerability, and that's true, I think, for domestic workers all around the world.
We have another question. This one comes from someone on Twitter, asking what steps the government in Indonesia is taking to protect citizens who are employed abroad. And let's make that more general as well. In Indonesia, I know the government is looking. Both the government does monitor the training facilities, and it also does some education of maids before they go abroad in terms of what their rights are. Here in Hong Kong, right now I'm in New York, but I think of myself as in Hong Kong. But in Hong Kong, the government really feels very strongly that maids can go to report any kind of abuse to the police or to their employment agency or the immigration department. But there really is, according to the maids, a big disconnect. And also, maids very often are extremely frightened of reporting because they fear they're going to lose their job and they're going to have to start all the way over again. And the reason that they're in Hong Kong is for money. So, Ai-jen, can you talk a little bit about, in terms of other places in the world, what should governments be doing so that maids are not so vulnerable?
It's a great question. We are part of a global federation of domestic workers called the International Domestic Worker Federation, and for many years we worked at the International Labor Organization to enact the first ILO Convention on Domestic Work, and it was enacted in 2011. And currently, around the world, 14 nations have ratified this ILO convention. And what it does is it establishes basic standards and protections for domestic workers globally. And governments should really be ratifying this convention. It provides a very comprehensive guide for what it would look like to bring this workforce into the 21st century and establish a basic minimum standard for protections and ensure that the human rights of this workforce are essentially protected and enforceable. In addition, governments in sending countries and receiving countries really need to pay attention to the special needs of migrant workers. And I know that our organization works closely with domestic worker organizations in sending countries for this very reason. It's a global issue that requires global coordination and collaboration.
We have a couple of questions about why Hong Kong requires its maids, its foreign maids, to live in, and I'll jump in on that one. When the policy began being developed, of course, at that time, Hong Kong was a British colony. It was in the 1970s. And what Hong Kong wanted to do was protect its local labor force. Hong Kong has very low unemployment, and they wanted to protect local workers. So women who want to do part-time work can do part-time work and not have to live in. But what they found was very few women living in Hong Kong, Hong Kong residents, wanted to do this kind of work, but the demand grew astronomically for this kind of work because women started joining the workforce, and also many Asian people, it's tradition to have multiple generations of families living in a home. So you may have little children, babies, 2 and 3, 5 years old, and then also have a grandmother or a grandfather living all in the same house with then the 2 breadwinners. So those folks really need somebody living in the house to take care of this multi-generational family. So the live-in rule really came about to protect local jobs and provide workers for this need, this very, very dramatically skyrocketing need. And that need's going to grow as the population of Hong Kong ages. So the idea behind the live-in rule is to protect local work and at the same time feed a demand. Hans, I just wanted to ask you on that question. People ask, well, what would the alternative be? Because very many foreign maids say, hey, I don't want to live with my employer. I feel like I'd like to have my own place. I would work fewer hours, and I'd have some privacy. What would the alternatives be? Is there any way to do that?
I think there's no doubt that if we think of the helpers' welfare, then they should apply to employers. Because if, that would stop, I think, at least to some extent, the abuse, the fact that they leave, they have to go out of the employer's house and talk to other people. Would certainly help prevent, I think, some of the cases that we see now repeatedly being reported at church shelters. Also, standard working hours. A helper is on call 24/7. If somebody wants a cup of tea at 2 in the morning, I mean, she's still on call. So most of the helpers that I interviewed would work 16 to 18 hours every day. All these issues would be helped if she didn't have to live with the employer. But I don't think it's realistic. I think policies need to be possible, they need to be feasible, and I can't see how it would be possible to get 320,000 affordable rooms in Hong Kong. So whilst I think it would be good for the helpers, for their welfare, I don't think the policy is feasible. So no, I don't think it's possible to go through with it. So other things would have to be done more.
We actually asked our readers of No Good Choices specifically about whether they agreed whether foreign maids should have to live full-time with their employers, and out of nearly 2,000 votes, only 6.5% said yes, foreign maids should have to live with their employers. 93.5% said no. And I think from the maids' perspective, they really would like the option. But as Hans points out, there is a problem. Hong Kong housing is very, very expensive, and 320,000 people needing housing in a city of 7 million people where housing is already tight. You could imagine the problem that it could bring about. Ai-jen, do you have any thoughts on this live-in rule? Do you believe in other places around the world that it opens up maids to abuse that they wouldn't be as vulnerable to otherwise?
Absolutely. Live-in workers in the United States face much higher rates of abuse than live-out domestic workers, and it's both in terms of wages and other forms of abuse. When you think about it, on average, live-in workers work much longer hours and have very little control over their time because they're seen as always available, always working. And it's a really unsustainable environment for a worker to be constantly on call, and as if her time was not her own. And especially for workers who have connections to family, or, in the United States, a lot of workers work live out. And there's also a need for live in. I think the choice is important. I think having standard working hours is important. I think overtime pay is important. When people are working beyond the agreed upon hours of their contract, they should be compensated at extra. And all of those things will help create a culture and a practice that's more sustainable for workers, where they can actually have a life in addition to their work.
That's all the time we have for questions. I'd like to thank Ai-jen and also Hans for joining us today. To read our story, go to wsj.com/maids. If you're sharing on social media, use #MaidsWSJ. Thanks so much for joining, and if you have additional questions, feel free to reach out to me at Deborah Jane Price at wallstreetjournal.com. It's wsj.com. Thanks so much for joining us.